Hi, I'm David Fowler, and I want to speak a word of encouragement to those of you who are perhaps frustrated, angry, distraught, discouraged by the change in the Republican Party's platform regarding the sanctity of life and the sanctity of marriage. Finding encouragement in the Republican Party's retreat on these issues might seem strange for someone like me who has spent the last 30 years in state politics, trying to extend constitutional protection to the unborn through the 14th Amendment and to restore the sanctity of marriage as a relationship defined in terms of a man and a woman. But I find that encouragement in three verses in Psalm 119, written by David, that is actually in the context of law, a fitting context for the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And these are those verses. Verse 67. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. Verse 71. It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. In verse 75. I know, O Lord, your judgments are right, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. These verses bear upon my own testimony in recent years and what I believe the Apostle Paul would have told me about how I understood politics and my engagement in politics. I think he would have told me that my understanding was frustrating the grace of God. That's a rather damning admission, and I want to explain it. But in explaining it, I hope it will help those of you who are disappointed that 50 years of pro life work in the Republican Party has been shunted aside by the party's leadership and its platform. The last 5 or 6 years of my 30 in politics have been the most politically frustrating, discouraging, and maddening time in my life. My efforts to extend protection to the unborn through the 14th Amendment by new arguments grounded in the common law and to protect marriage, again, by arguments through the common law, have been almost universally rejected by those I consider friends and allies. And to be honest, I did not respond well to it, but in bitterness and anger. But you see, it was part of a process, I believe, of God working in me to help me understand where I had gone wrong and misunderstood the gospel. I find this misunderstanding in my life in Paul's letter to the Galatians, who became confused about who Christ was and what he had done. Here is what he wrote: I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I live in the flesh, I live by faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And then he added these key words: I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. In other words, if whatever I was doing was not proceeding from grace by faith in the person of Christ living in me, well, then I was frustrating the grace of God. When I am working out of my own resources, my own strength, my own power, and if that's all that's really needed to keep the law of God, to be righteous, then indeed Christ is superfluous. He died in vain. And Paul continues, Oh, foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Namely, that no effort by law is going to bring about righteousness. It would never succeed. And then these crushing words by the apostle: Are you so foolish? Having begun in the spirit, you are now made perfect by the flesh. In other words, by your own strength, your own grit, your own determination, your own power, your own resources? Is that now how you finish what was begun by the Spirit? You finish with law? You see, I had to learn that the way I conceived of politics and engagement in law as bringing about righteousness in my own state was by law, by enacting laws. Law, you see, is what would do the trick. And that kind of thinking in me was directly contrary to the whole principle of grace. I was frustrating the grace of God. But what I spent almost 30 years of doing is how you do it. If your thoughts are more informed by Machiavelli than the Word of God, by the power of human beings rather than the power of God's grace by faith working in his people, believing that faith in God and the power of God by grace is stronger and greater than any Donald Trump or the Republican Party to bring about righteousness in a nation. No, Machiavelli, see, would tell us to go to the highest power in the land, the president, the Congress, the United States Supreme Court, and wrest from them the law that would then shape society to make it righteousness. But that's not how the gospel works. That's not even how the law of God works. Because Paul tells the Christians in Galatia that God did not give a law that could impart life. And you see, life is what we need, and it comes from God, and that produces righteousness, not the law. So I believe the retreat of the Republican Party is God tearing down, as in the days of old, an idol, one erected on the principle of Machiavellian power. And I believe allegiance to and trust in the Republican Party to bring about righteous laws was frustrating the reliance of God's people on his grace. And so he's given us a gentle warning that do not put your trust there. The answer to this partisan retreat then is not to redouble our efforts of pushing this Machiavellian power structure boulder up the Republican hill as Sisyphus was condemned to do for eternity, but it's to return to the Word of God and search it out diligently, to trust more in the one God has set on his holy hill, who's the King of Kings, and to let that then inform how we engage in politics and legal advocacy in the future. It's not a call to leave those spheres, but to rethink what we're doing, and not to think that if we just do what we've been doing better, we will succeed. As Hosea said, come, let us return to the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He has smitten, and he will bind us up.